Hi, everyone. Well, as you just said, my name is Andrés Gutiérrez, and I'm a tech entrepreneur from Colombia. A couple of weeks ago, I was talking to Janma and the people from the summit about this newfound interest in Latin American startups. Last year, Latin American startups received over $17 billion in venture capital. To put this into perspective, this is the last 5 years doubling that, and that's what Latin American startups raised last year. Out of 27 companies that are over $1 billion in valuation called unicorns, 16 of them graduated last year. We spoke a bit about this newfound interest, but something that really caught my attention as we were talking about our stories was how in certain moments of this journey, people started considering us crazies, or that our ideas were crazy. They didn't have enough, down-to-earth reality. I think that's when I realized what better subject than to share with you how a crazy idea can become a successful venture. Hopefully to really inspire all of you, if you're entrepreneurs, to continue pursuing your crazy idea, and if you're investors, because I know there's a couple of investors back there, to continue backing these crazy ideas. As I started studying and looking about startups, I realized that this concept of crazy idea to successful venture was a lot more common than what we all thought. So let's start this journey. I think the best way to start this conversation with this quote from Elon Musk saying, "Good ideas are always crazy until they're not." I'll read it again. Good ideas are always considered crazy until somehow, they discover that they're not that crazy. What's interesting about this quote from Elon Musk is that could have been a bunch of ideas he had. From underground tunnel infrastructure called the Boring Company, which Elon Musk is trying to build these tunnels to end what he calls soul-destroying traffic. This idea plans to lower cars underneath the ground and basically transport them 140 miles an hour to their next destination. Crazy, right? Well, this idea just raised last year $675 million at a valuation of $6 billion. But that's not the only crazy idea that Elon Musk may have been referring to with this quote. This is a company he started in 2002 called SpaceX. He actually poured 1/3 of his fortune into this company because other investors didn't back his idea. And he actually called this first concept of rockets Dragon, based out of the song Puff the Magic Dragon, because a lot of his critics thought his idea was really impossible. And maybe another of the startups he was building was this one that he started in 1998 called X.com. X.com actually became the precursor of PayPal. But what's interesting about PayPal is that in the year 1999, it was voted as one of the 10 worst ideas of the world. Basically, his function was doing Palm Pilot to Palm Pilot transfers. And that was a crazy idea in the opinion of most. But what's interesting is, a couple of years later, PayPal not just become one of the most important fintechs in the continent, but last year alone, it had $25 billion in revenue. To put this in perspective, this is more than the GDP of Honduras or the GDP of Salvador. This is what that company processed in revenue last year, and it had a valuation of $100 billion. So we're starting to see this trend that crazy ideas, isn't that just bad? What's interesting about this concept of crazy ideas, it's not just a new phenomenon. Over 500 years ago, an Italian gentleman by the name of Leonardo, of a town called Vinci, ergo his name, Leonardo da Vinci, came up with this concept called the helical screw linen. So this was basically a concept that he said that a linen screw was going to compress air to create flight. This was an idea of 1498 that just 400 years later become the concept of the helicopter. Leonardo da Vinci didn't just come up with this, but he created the first model of a diving suit to go underwater and actually the first parachute. And obviously, as you can imagine, people were considering him crazy when he created this concept around 1400s. But let's fast forward a couple years. 1999, and this 24-year-old decides that he wants to sell shoes online. If you ever purchased shoes before, or if you're like me, you probably run into the problem that you're trying 2 or 3 different examples, and probably shoes are the most difficult item to sell in terms of clothing. So this 24-year-old created this company. or started building this company, and he started presenting it to investors. Similar to Elon Musk, he wasn't able to reach enough capital for his idea, and because 4 years into his venture, his company was not profitable, he had to sell most of his apartments to basically put that money into the company. It was such level of doubt that a firm called Draper Richards, which is a VC firm, actually provided him $250,000 in capital, with the condition that he could ask the money back if he didn't consider the company was worth backing. So as you can imagine, when the bond or when this vehicle came to maturity, he had to return the money out because this venture capital firm didn't believe in him. However, 10 years later, in 2009, this company was bought by Amazon by $1.2 billion. It was one of the largest e-commerce purchases at the time, and once again, all starting from a crazy idea. But one of my favorite came from an email from two roommates who were living in San Francisco in 2009, and remember, 2009, recession year. And they basically shared this email saying, hey, Brian, I have this crazy idea. Why don't we put aside a room or a section in our apartment and we'll rent it out? We'll provide the guest Wi-Fi, a desk so he can work, and maybe even breakfast. He came up with this idea, we can make money. This was a designer convention that was happening in San Francisco. All the hotels were full. So these two designers had this idea of renting out their apartment. And what's really interesting here is that they were actually renting out a sleeping mat. This wasn't even a bed, guys. This was a mattress, an air inflatable mattress, and this was the idea. They actually pitched this up to VCs, and no VC accepted meetings with them. Actually, two investors said, one, guys, I hope you're working on another idea, because this idea is crazy. Another one actually said, there's no way I'm touching this idea, because I don't want to be liable for murder. And when they said that, the entrepreneurs asked the VC, what are you talking about for murder? And the investor said, guys, these are how horror movies start. You let a stranger sleep in your couch, in your mattress, in the middle of the night, the guy's going to wake up with an axe, he's going to kill you. I don't want to touch this. However, these guys considered to pursue their innovation. And you guys know what company I'm talking about here? Correct, Airbnb. This company ended up not just revolutionizing the hotel industry completely, but now they have presence in over 200 countries, over 10,000 cities. And last year alone, they had a valuation of over $100 billion from a crazy idea. So let's fast forward another 3 years, and this is where I come in. So let's all settle 2012 Bogota, Colombia. 2012 Bogota, Colombia, there was not even one tech startup that had exit or had a successful venture. There were no accelerators, no mentors. There was one co-working space and one venture capital, which are the firms that invest in startups. Just to put you guys into perspective, at this time in Israel, there were 30 different VCs. Colombia, one. Country 4 times the size. You can imagine what happened when I went to give my pitch to the VC in Colombia. They said no. But we were really understanding that there was a huge problem here. The problem was 1 million people rode taxis every day in Bogota, per day. And 1 million of these people had pretty much two options. One, they call a telephone number requesting a taxi from the radio company, but that could last 20 minutes. That could last 20 minutes trying to request the taxi, or you can hail it on the street. The problem of hailing it on the street is, I don't know if you've ever been, or if you've been to Colombia recently, but there was a huge problem called Paseo Millonario. And Paseo Millonario was that if you hailed a taxi on the street, there was a good chance that that taxi driver wasn't really a taxi driver, and they'd actually take you to ATMs and withdraw money from your bank. And it's not just anecdotal. In the year 2012, there was 150 cases of Paseo Millonario in Bogota. This means every 3 days, somebody was hailing a taxi on the street, and unfortunately, he was getting robbed. But people were still getting the taxi on the street, still hailing them, because calling telephone was a 20-minute, 30-minute experience, which was brutal. So in that moment, with my co-founder, Juan Salcedo, we decided to create an app. Why couldn't an app solve this problem for millions of Colombians? 6 months ago, prior to Tpaga, there was an app doing this in London called Halo. So we basically saw that there was a possibility of copying and pasting this idea. And we decided not to copy and paste the idea. We realized that this is probably one of the biggest mistakes that Latin American and emerging market startups do, which is they try to just copy and paste that idea without even really considering that that idea probably needs to be adapted to that unique marketplace, or that local market has some nuances that it probably isn't the same if we would have copied and pasted this idea from London. Let's jump into those. We couldn't just offer what they call a regular person picking you up a car. We had to do it with taxis. Why? Because this is a picture of 8 months ago in Bogota. 10 years after Uber's been in Bogota, they're still putting them fines and they're still capturing cars because they're illegal. So if we would have just copied that, what we call personal car service instead of taxis, we would have been clobbered with fines. We would have never gotten our idea up in speed. At the same time, since we realized that safety was such a big issue, we realized that we needed to make safety our value proposition. Like I mentioned, in Bogota, 2012, a taxi driver could go to a taxi company, he'd just show his driver's license, his ID, and they'll give him a radio taxi. And that was the way they were served taxis. They were doing zero background checks. And we decided that had to be our value proposition. So we built an internal algorithm to pick up 70 different background checks to ensure that the driver was actually a safe driver. At the same time, we couldn't just copy and paste features of apps like Uber that actually shared your telephone number with the driver, because that would be unsafe. Actually, when our competitors launched in Colombia, they didn't tailor their app, and they were basically sharing the telephone number of ladies with the drivers. Well, in Colombia, what happened a couple months after they launched, taxi drivers shared or saved that telephone number of the passenger and started sending them inappropriate pictures. So we realized that basically the safety features had to be really important here. And one of the safety features that really boosted our growth was, I don't know how it was if it was ever here in Guatemala the same, but in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Peru, when people hailed a taxi on the street, they actually sent a text message to their parents, to your girlfriends or friends saying, hey guys, I'm in this license plate. Just in case something happens to me, you can track it. We realized that this was a practice that everybody was doing when they're hailing a ride on the street. So we decided, why don't we just create this same functionality of sharing your license plate and sharing the route, but let's embed it in social media. How about we tell you, hey Andres, next time you hail a taxi, why don't you share this license plate in Facebook? So when we started doing this, people started sharing it in social media, and we started having a network effect of 150. So as we were searching social media, you started realizing Andres took a Tappsi, somebody else took a Tappsi, and we started realizing that this was a great strategy for growth. It's what they call growth hacking in Silicon Valley. We realized, I don't know if you can see here, but this is efectivo, which means cash. So basically, we couldn't copy and paste all the ride-hailing apps that paid with a credit card, because in Colombia, card penetration was close to 20%. So if we forced people to pay with credit card, we would have limited our market enormously. So we had to open up a cash format. And another something that happened, and I realized it's the same here when I was hailing a taxi here in Antigua, the taxis in Bogota have a very small trunk. So if you're actually going to the airport and you request a taxi and you don't specify you're going to a taxi, chances are that you're not going to be able to fit your bags in the trunk. So we realized if we, once again, customize our app by telling the driver, hey, I'm going to the airport, the driver now knows that he has to have a big enough trunk to actually fit the rider there. Also, if you've ever been to Bogota and if you've gone out to a famous party place called Andrés Gutiérrez, that's a taxi ride from Bogota to a place called Chia. Taxi drivers from Bogota cannot go to Chia because it's a different municipality. So they have to have a special permission. We were seeing that a lot of times passengers were having this huge pain that they were hailing a taxi on the street and saying, hey, I need to go to Chia. And the taxi driver says, oops, I can't take you because I don't have a special permission. We started adapting all these functionalities so that we can really provide a value-added service for our passengers and obviously for our drivers. And then, with every crazy idea that starts being a bit successful, you start generating competitors, right? At a certain moment of time, we had over 15 different taxi apps pretty much offering the same service. And two in particular were really interesting. One called Easy Taxi and the other one called Uber. For those who've been in the tech space long enough, like I have, might recognize Easy Taxi's venture capital, or the investor called Rocket Internet. Basically, Rocket Internet was the equivalent of SoftBank before SoftBank. These guys in a certain year were accounting 1/3 of all the tech investments in the region. And we were competing against Easy Taxi, and they had funding $30 million, and we had just raised $600,000. So it was a really tough competition. And we were also facing competition against Uber, which at a certain moment of time was the most valuable company in the world. So we were competing against these two companies. But something really interesting happened as we were competing with them. We realized sometimes competition's not that bad. Why? Because one, competition really helps validate your idea. If you're the only startup doing a service, and you've been there doing it for certain years, chances are probably those people are right, that you have a crazy idea and you don't have traction. But once you start picking up competitors, it really validates that your idea might be worth something. The second good thing about competition that I think a lot of people don't consider is that when you're launching a service or new product, sometimes the most difficult challenge is convincing consumers to change the habit. We were trying to convince consumers to stop calling and start doing it with an app. And we were alone in this venture. But as competitors start doing the same sort of evangelización and convincing consumer, we start realizing that the market was actually being helped by our competitors. At the same time, the toughest sell we had with Tappsi was convincing taxi drivers to buy a smartphone. At the time, smartphone penetration was only 35%. So if we were the only company trying to convince the taxi driver to buy a smartphone, it was a difficult sell. But as soon as Uber, Easy, Didi, and all these companies were doing that, that actually helped. And the third good thing about having competitors is that they're big competitors like these, well, one of them can actually become a buyer. And actually, 3 years after we created Tappsi, we were acquired by Easy Taxi, which was the largest taxi hailing company in Latam. This converted us in the largest in the continent, one of the 5th largest taxi companies in the world, and we were having presence in 4 continents and 30 countries. So this really became a good opportunity to have that first exit. This took me to the board of Easy Taxi in Berlin, because once again, Rocket Internet, which was this biggest investor, was based in Germany. And as I was in the board, I realized that in all the countries, we had one huge problem. All rides were cash. And remember how I mentioned how that was a value proposition? Well, now this value proposition was becoming an opportunity. We realized that cash payments was sometimes an inconvenient. If it happened like it happened to me right now, I arrived from Bogota, I didn't change the quetzales, and I tried paying the taxi driver with my card. The guy looked at me and said, I don't have a way. So sometimes that problematic can be an opportunity. At the same time, taxi drivers had a problem of carrying too much cash. Especially in countries like Colombia and Ecuador, a lot of the times the taxi drivers are actually robbed at gunpoint because they're basically driving ATMs. At a certain moment of time, he can have $200 just parked in one of his dashboards, and a passenger comes up at night, says, take me up to this neighborhood, and they rob him. So we realized there was a huge pain point here. And as I was leaving the board of Easy Taxi, I asked them if I can try to create a solution for these cash payments. So I started asking the taxi drivers, hey, if I start charging people with credit card, what's your bank account so I can transfer money to your bank account? Pretty innocent question, right? Problem was taxi drivers started laughing at me and said, what are you talking about bank account? I don't have a bank account. And that's when crazy idea number 2 comes in, and we decide to create a bank. That's right, we decide to build a bank. We start realizing that today, a bank doesn't have to be millions of dollars in bank branches. It doesn't have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in ATM. We don't have to force consumers to actually take a bus, to walk into our offices and sign with a paper to open up a bank account. You can just do it with your phone. That object I think everybody has in their pockets or purses, we realized that this could be the best enabler for a bank. Why was this a crazy idea? Well, I don't know if you guys are aware, but banks in Latam have the highest return on equity of all banks in the world. So I'm going to say that with different words. The banks in Latin America are the most profitable banks in the world. Typical bank in Europe or the States has a return on equity of 4%, 4 or 5%. Banks in Latam have a return on equity of 18%. So we were going up against the most profitable companies in the world, companies that have 100 years ahead of us. But we realized if we were able to disrupt the taxi industry, the most probably regulated, controlled by mafias type, why can't we do it with banks? But what we realized here is that if we were going to go against the most profitable and powerful companies in the country, we needed some help. So we applied to an accelerator called Y Combinator in summer 2017. To give you guys an idea, Y Combinator has an admission percentage lower than applying to Harvard Business School. So these guys accept less companies than Harvard Business School. Till date, there were only 4 companies of Colombia who had been able to enter YC, and we decided to apply, and luckily we were accepted. We become the 5th company of Colombia accepted into this accelerator in Silicon Valley, and these guys basically have this short version MBA to help your startup become successful. They basically provide mentors, they provide access to investors, and they really surround you by peers because they really understand that these are 3 components to help a startup. They really focus on, with data, why do startups fail? And the 2 arguments, or the 2 biggest reasons why startups fail is 1, fight between founders. Founders at certain moments start fighting with each other, each one takes a different route, and that's one of the biggest causes. And 2, access to capital. So during this accelerator, they really focus on working on those 2 items. And as I was ready to do my pitch, sort of introducing myself, thinking I was the craziest idea out there, I was delightfully shocked when the person before of me, when he was starting to say his pitch, he said, "Hi, I'm Jason, and I'm building a new rocket fuel." And as he was elaborating, he said, yes, the problem that rocket fuels have for space missions is that it doesn't have the viscosity needed for zero gravity environments. And at that moment, it's when I realized, you know what? I'm not the only crazy guy here. This in Silicon Valley is just another day. So with this, as we start building this journey, we actually meet amazing investors, which I think a couple of investors are here in the audience, Invariantes, Inogen, and Mountain Nazca. Back there, we start receiving amazing investors. And with their help, we become the fastest growing mobile wallet in Latin America. We grow from 100,000 users to 2.5 million users in 16 months. We grow from processing $1 million to $10 million a month, and grow from revenue of $10,000 to $300,000 a month in just 18 months. And we're just getting started. We realize that if we can do our job well, it's not just going to be Colombia. Hopefully, it can be more countries of Latin America. And when we talk about this, this is really, it's not just a business goal, it's a personal goal for me. I've seen the power of financial inclusion. And I really think that one of the 2 biggest challenges that our generation has is education and access to financial service. I'm going to make a quick anecdote of why. Twice, as we were providing a bank account for taxi drivers, the taxi drivers asked me, "Hey, thanks for allowing me to build my bank account, but can you give me a credit?" First, we said, "No, we're not giving credits, but I'm curious, why can't you get a credit?" He said, "Twice I've walked into different banks, and I've asked them if I can get a credit to pay for my college education, for my son's college education. And twice the bank said no." And when I asked them, why did the bank say no? Because I know how much you earn, because I know how much payments you're getting, and you gain 3 times more than the minimum wage of Colombia. He says, they say no because when I go to a bank for credit, they look at my credit history. So they ask for my government ID. Since I've never had a credit, there's no track record there. And then when they ask me, can you do any support of your income? I take out a stash of bills, and I show them, this is my income. Bank said, that's no way I can validate. So twice, the taxi driver was denied a credit. And what happens here when people are denied credit, they fall within this category of what we call poverty trap. Because he starts getting credits of what we call in Colombia gota gota, which are informal credits that have a 25% monthly interest. And once he falls into that trap, it's very difficult for him to escape. And this doesn't happen to Gerson Taxista. 50% of the population of Latin America are following right here behind us. As I continue my growth with Tappsi, I'm very honored to be accepted into an organization called Endeavor. And this organization called Endeavor is a global organization that helps entrepreneurs scale. The mentors here are people from the categories of Reid Hoffman from LinkedIn and Jorge Paulo Leman from 3G Capital in Brazil. I realized that with these mentors, my chances of succeeding are a lot higher. At the same time, I joined an accelerator from Amsterdam called Rockstart to become a mentor and start giving back to the new startups that were coming up from Colombia. And as I was doing this, I realized I'm very lucky, these guys are very lucky, but if it's hard to succeed being in Bogota, with the network that I have, imagine somebody in the rural regions. Imagine somebody's of minorities. In that moment, Forbes Colombia came out with an article saying 90% of all VC funding goes to 2 cities in Colombia, Bogota and Medellin. And less than 10% is going to women, and less than 1% are going to Afros in Colombia. Afros in Colombia are 10% of the population, and they're only getting access to 1%. So that's when, a Friday afternoon, after a couple of drinks, I shoot this sort of memo to my investor saying, guys, we need to change this. This is unfair. We need to balance the playing fields. And after doing that, I send them a message saying, I'm going to Chocó, which is one of the most poorest regions of Colombia, based in the Pacific, and I'm going to go there, and I'm going to invest in startups. After writing that email, another investor writes, I'm going to go with you. After that investor contacts that same journalist of Forbes, he says, I want to go with you. And once he writes an article, what we're doing, the Colombian government finds out that we're going to do this initiative, and they decide to support. So this crazy idea becomes now what we call in Colombia, the Copa Colombia al Emprendimiento. And the mission is to go to remote regions twice a year and provide them with access to capital, mentors, and last event, Simón Borrero, the founder of Rappi, which is one of the largest unicorns, decided to go. And we became one of the best accelerators for Colombia. And just to finish this and wrap it up, I want to end again with this quote. Remember, guys, good ideas are always considered crazy until they're not. So if you're an entrepreneur, please continue building upon your crazy idea. And if you're an investor, please continue backing these crazy ones, because the chances are they're going to be successful. And these guys are going to change the future. So thank you very much. That's it.